So let's have a chat through Data Gateway. So many of the examples that you might have seen with 1Integrate is it working server-side, working behind the scenes and doing a lot of the complex data processing. Data Gateway actually takes 1Integrate more from a server-side technology and puts it more in a web-based environment. So actually it's a very easy access for organizations to get use of the rules and actions within inside 1Integrate. Now, let me just explain a little bit in terms of why we developed Data Gateway. Now, it's designed to fit that need where organizations are having a data supply chain of many to one. So in other words, many organizations or indeed many individuals creating data and submitting that through to one central environment. And in that sort of scenario, there are a couple of key problems. First of all, the quality of both the spatial contents, but indeed, context, but also the content of the data submission that's coming through can be very varied depending on who's sending that through, and often doesn't conform to what's required by that central organization receiving all the data. Second problem, if that happens, often that data is rejected and sent back to whoever is supplying that data in the first place. And you get that horrible cycle of submission and rejection, which ultimately means that any data process in that way is greatly delayed. This is often seen in federated data models, for example in the US, where counties might be supplying data to a state level and a state level then supplying data up to a federal level. But actually it happens in non-federated environments quite often. So for example, where one organization is using multiple contractors to create data and submit that through. And what we looked at actually doing with Data Gateway is how can we reduce that submission time, reduce and ensure we don't have that submit-reject cycle, such that data is, when supplied, can actually be accepted first or second time around. Now let me give you a couple of examples where we've really been doing that, and I'm going to give a couple of examples in the US. So the first one is actually with federal highways. So every year, federal highways requires the US states to submit their highway data through to them. There are 52 states or so within inside the US. Obviously, there are some districts. But as I say, every year, the 52 of them need to submit their data through to federal highways. As you can imagine, everyone ends up submitting their data at the same time. And that puts a lot of strain in terms of the architecture that federal highways have in place. Now, when working with federal highways, there are a couple of areas that we wanted to improve in the process. The first one, when the data is submitted and it goes through its process to identify either where the content or indeed the context does not meet the federal highways requirements, that process runs through and a report will be sent back to the state in terms of where the problems actually exist. The issue, however, is that it didn't actually pinpoint exactly where the problems were with the data being sent through. It just said there were problems with inside the data and wouldn't be accepted. Now, that's one area that we needed to address. And secondly, the actual processing time taken when the data is sent up was quite long. So it could be a matter of days that a state was waiting for the information to come back to them, which they could then act on, which doesn't really help them in terms of their submission cycle. So we looked at Data Gateway in terms of improving that process. So firstly, we could pinpoint exactly where any errors were in the data. So the state didn't need to hunt around and try and find where those problems are. It was exactly pinpointed which they could address. And secondly, because Data Gateway is 1Integrate technology, the actual processing is extremely quick. So when data is loaded up to the federal highways environment, it can very quickly be processed and the results sent straight back to the state. So they don't have that sort of day's delay in getting the response. So that's one example. A second example is actually with US Census. And that takes it to a whole another level, whereas instead of it actually being 52 submissions coming through, they get over 3,200 submissions coming through every year. And again, the same principles as federal highways, whereby when the data comes in, it can very quickly be validated and reports sent back to the end users. So in terms of what Data Gateway actually is, it's an extension to 1Integrate that effectively sits on top, that allows organizations to submit data through a web-based environment. The validation rules and enhancements actions are then run, and reports actually sent back to the submitting organization. And as I say, the key thing is for any non-conformances when run against the rules will be identified. But also what we're able to do is run those enhancement scenarios of the data. So we might actually be able to automatically fix up those problems. Now, the reality is a lot of the time those enhancements won't actually be done, because whoever's submitting the data are the only ones who should be responsible for changing that data in some way. However, what we can do is actually send back enhanced data as a recommendation as what might actually be able to happen to the data to make it pass the conformance rules next times around. So we're not actually saying on changing the data itself, we're actually sending back data that says, look, this is what you could do to your data, and if you did, it would then pass those validation rules. So the nice thing is it's very, very easy to deploy. It can be run as a hosted service, so there's actually no necessity for an organization to host anything themselves, and then they can make that available to those submitters of data such that literally they'll be able to upload the data, run the rules and actions, and get those reports as I explained earlier. In addition, you'll see when Chris demonstrates it in a minute, there's a pretty nice dashboard environment as well that can start to give some really good analysis and metrics in terms of the quality of information that is being submitted. So what I'll do now is hand over to Chris, and he can actually give you a live demonstration of that working.
Thank you, Duncan. What I'll do now is I'll just jump out of the presentation and open up a browser window. From the browser window, I can select my 1Integrate for DataGateway option. This brings up a login, a username and password. I can select the utility demo, and I can then enter my password, and then I log in. And as Duncan mentioned, what we're presented with is a very simple interface, and all I do is I select this button here to select the file that I wish to validate. And I can select the file, so I'm just going to select this water zone data here, and I click on open. What it then does is it uploads the data, and then it reads the data, validating the schema that's within that data. Once that's happened, I can then either have a look at the uploaded data, or I can simply click on this Run Rule Set button here. When I click on Run Rule Set, the rules get run, and we'll see any non-conformances show up at the end of the processing. And you can see what is green is good, they've passed, what is orange is not so good, and there are some failures. So what I can do is I can click down the bottom right here and view the resultant data. So I click that button and it opens up a viewer into that data. And here are all of the exceptions that have been found during the process. And if I zoom in a little bit, you can see things like sewer geometry must be longer than 1 meter. So there's a very short segment of line there that we need to have a look at and maybe remove. No pipes must burst more than twice, so that's a problem there. So we need to have a look at what's going on at that point. And again, there's another material does not equal null. So we must have a material within that we must have a material present on that pipe as an attribute. So this information can be fed back to the people who have submitted that data, and they can fix that data and then go through the same validation process prior to submitting it to the central database. Now, as Duncan mentioned, there is also a nice dashboard interface that shows you what's going on, and I click the dashboard button here, and I go and click the dashboard button, and you can see that we've got a total pass and fail here. We've got a pie chart here that tells us what sort of rules have caused the most failures. We've got one there that's no pipes must be burst more than twice. And if I just move down, you can see the total pass and failure for each of the separate rules and actions that have been run. And then we've got a overtime pass and failure rate, so we can work out what's happening over a period of time. And you can of course configure the dashboards to be what you like, and you can add in new sections to the dashboard, and you can save your own dashboard, so you can add widgets in. You can change whether the view is stacked or as such, or whether it's side by side, so it's stacked there and then side by side, and so on and so forth. So it's your choice how you build up your dashboard, and you can save your particular dashboard.